Picture the desert at night, the air cooling fast after the sun's retreat, and the faint rustle of wind across sand that has been here far longer than any human memory. Somewhere beneath your feet, beneath the drifting dunes and the cracked limestone, the bones of a story are waiting. We have been told for generations that the pyramids of Giza rose around 4,500 years ago under the rule of kings whose names are still carved into temple walls. But what if that story is only the final act of a much older tale? What if these colossal shapes were already ancient when the first hominid walked the earth? You might already be picturing stone cutters in white linen skirts, the sun blazing down, oxen pulling sledges. But imagine something stranger. Imagine the same scene, except the air is cooler, the Nile is wider, and the horizon is dotted not with sand, but with patches of grass and scattered trees. Somewhere far away, ice sheets the size of continents grind slowly toward the sea. It's not the Egypt you learned about in school. This is Egypt before humanity, before any bipedal creature gazed at the stars. In recent decades, a handful of geologists and historians have looked at the Giza Plateau and noticed things that don't quite fit the official narrative. The limestone enclosure around the Great Sphinx, for example, is weathered in a way that suggests it has endured centuries of heavy rainfall that hasn't been common in this part of the world for thousands of years. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, famously argued in the 1990s that the Sphinx could be much older than dynastic Egypt, possibly dating back to the end of the last ice age. Mainstream Egyptologists pushed back hard, pointing out the lack of artifacts or inscriptions to support such a date. Historians are still debating whether these erosion patterns are the fingerprints of an ancient climate or simply the result of wind and sand over time. It's an odd thing to consider, especially when you realize how much of history rests on the assumption that intelligent life on Earth began with humans. Most textbooks start the story of advanced beings around 5,000 years ago with the rise of city-states and organized agriculture. But every so often an artifact or a ruin slips into view and seems to whisper quietly but insistently that we might have overlooked something. Think of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. A complex of massive carved stones erected 11,600 years ago, long before the supposed invention of agriculture. Its existence doesn't prove that the pyramids are older than humanity, but it does remind us that beings were shaping stone with remarkable skill deep into prehistory. There's a strange comfort in the official story. It's neat, it's chronological, and it fits well with what's already in museums. But the human mind has a weakness for neatness. It prefers smooth surfaces to rough edges. And history, real history, is full of rough edges. If you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and run your fingers over its weathered blocks, you're touching stone that was ancient even in the age of the first primates. Those stones have been rained on, baked, shaken by earthquakes, and brushed by the hands of countless pilgrims, scholars, and looters. They've seen the stars shift in the night sky, the desert expand and contract, and the Nile change its course. It's easy to imagine that the desert hides many things. Odd fact, in 2013, archaeologists in the Egyptian desert uncovered a complete Roman-era ship buried hundreds of miles from the sea. A reminder that what lies beneath the sand isn't always what we expect. And if a ship can survive in the desert for nearly 2,000 years, why couldn't something far older, an earlier layer of the pyramids themselves, be waiting under those limestone blocks? The challenge is that stone is both patient and deceptive. A block of weathered limestone might be 20 years old or 20,000, and unless it carries an inscription, the truth can be hard to pin down. That's part of what makes the pre-human theory so tantalizing. It offers an older, Messier history, one that doesn't fit neatly into the boxes of evolutionary timelines. But it also leaves us with vast empty spaces where certainty should be. And in those spaces, imagination starts to take root. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. It's a small way to let me know you're out there somewhere under your own patch of night sky. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? As you think about that, picture the pyramids not as the crowning achievement of a young species, but as something inherited, something that stood silent for eons before being discovered by the first humans. Imagine them as survivors, their sharp edges dulled by thousands of years of wind and rain before hominids even began. You don't have to believe it. You only have to let the possibility drift across your mind like a thin cloud over a bright moon. After all, history is not only what happened, it's also what we're willing to consider. Part 2. The Sphinx's Silent Testimony. If you have only ever known Egypt through photographs, documentaries, or perhaps a single visit in the height of summer, you might believe this land has always been dry. The kind of dryness that draws lines across your lips and makes your eyes ache under the sun's glare. The Giza Plateau, with its beige expanse and its colossal monuments, seems to belong to a world utterly removed from the gentleness of rain. Yet, if you trace the scars on its stones, you might begin to suspect that water once had a much more intimate conversation with this landscape. The Great Sphinx, guardian of the plateau, is the most eloquent witness. Its massive lion's body and human face are carved directly into the bedrock, and around it lies an enclosure, walls of limestone whose surfaces tell a story no inscription records. These walls are etched with deep vertical channels, grooves that curl and smooth as they descend, the kind of shapes that moving water tends to leave behind. Geologists who study erosion patterns have learned to distinguish the signature of wind from that of rain. Wind erosion is horizontal, sharp-edged, like a blade scraping in one direction. Water, by contrast, softens. It curls its way down, wearing pockets and folds, creating a kind of rippling effect in the stone. Robert Schoch, a Boston University geologist, first made international headlines in the 1990s by suggesting that these patterns could not have been made by mere centuries of wind and sand. In his view, they spoke of centuries of heavy rainfall of the kind that has not been common here for at least 7,000 years. Schoch's conclusion was bold. If the Sphinx's enclosure showed signs of water erosion, then the monument must have been carved long before the time of any human, perhaps even before the end of the last ice age, when the Sahara was a land of grass and rivers. This idea met fierce resistance from Egyptologists whose timeline for the Sphinx was anchored in archaeological evidence from human eras. The argument went like this: the Sphinx resembles the face of Khafu's statues. It sits next to his pyramid complex, and the surrounding temples use limestone blocks quarried from the very pit in which the Sphinx rests. Therefore, the most logical explanation is that Khafu ordered its construction around 2500 BC. Any erosion, they said, could be the result of wind, sand, or even the occasional flood caused by rising groundwater in ancient times. Historians are still debating whether the weathering is a clue to a much earlier origin or simply a byproduct of later natural forces. The truth is frustratingly slippery. Stone holds its age in ways that resist easy measurement. Dating it is not like dating a piece of wood or bone with radiocarbon techniques. Without an inscription saying carved in the year 10, the argument must rely on interpretation. Geology versus archaeology. Climate science versus cultural context. To complicate matters further, the Sphinx is not the only structure with puzzling erosion. Nearby, blocks from the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple, massive limestone and granite constructions, show similar weathering, and in some cases erosion more severe than that on the Sphinx itself. Some have proposed that these temples too were originally built, or at least begun in a wetter era and only later incorporated into the grand design of human history. Understanding how such an era could exist here means stepping back into deep time. Imagine the end of the last ice age between 12,000 and 9,000 years ago. The polar ice caps and glaciers were melting rapidly, pouring fresh water into the oceans, altering global wind and rainfall patterns. In North Africa, this was the African humid period, a time when monsoon rains reached far north into the Sahara. Vast lakes formed where there is now only sand. The Nile swelled with seasonal floods far greater than anything in recorded history, and the surrounding land bloomed. If a monument had been cut into limestone during this era, it would have endured years, perhaps centuries, of seasonal soaking. This paints a very different picture from the Egypt you know. Picture yourself standing before the Sphinx. Then the air smells of wet soil and crushed leaves. The nearby plateau is dotted with pools left by recent rains. And somewhere in the distance, a waterfall tumbles into a rocky basin, an almost unthinkable image in modern Giza. The Sphinx itself, freshly carved or already centuries old, drips with water, its flanks darkened by the storm. Odd fact, even in the hyper-arid modern Sahara, sudden downpours still happen, and they can be catastrophic. In 1975, a rare storm in Algeria dumped so much water in a single day that rivers formed where none had existed for decades. It's not hard to imagine that in a greener age, those rivers and rains could persist for months on end, gradually shaping any exposed rock. If the Sphinx truly predates humanity, it would mean that the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty inherited not just land, but monumental architecture already eons old. They might have restored it, reshaped it, or even recarved its face to resemble their own rulers. Later construction could have obscured the fact that they were working with something far older, something left by beings we can barely imagine. The stakes of this debate are more than just academic. If proven true, it would extend the history of monumental architecture on Earth by thousands of years, placing its beginnings in a time when, according to mainstream history, no intelligent life should have been capable of such feats. It would challenge the very timeline we've built for life on Earth, forcing us to admit that advanced building techniques might have been known and then forgotten long before humans evolved. And yet, here is where the patience of stone meets the impatience of humans. The Sphinx will not tell us when it was carved. The grooves in its enclosure will not whisper the century in which they were formed. They are simply there, mute but insistent, daring us to match their story with our own understanding of the past. As the desert wind brushes over the plateau, carrying with it the dry scent of dust, it's almost possible to hear the echoes of that long goodbye, the retreat of the rains, the slow fading of rivers, the transformation of a green land into a golden one. That transformation, more than any war or king or dynasty, might have been the true turning point in Earth's history. It set the stage for the desert we know today, and for the mysteries that still stand upon it. Part 3: Echoes of Forgotten Builders. Strip away the hieroglyphs, the royal cartouches, and the carved images of pharaohs offering incense to the gods, and what remains is the raw, silent geometry of stone. The blocks do not tell you who placed them. They do not lean toward one dynasty or another. They simply exist, indifferent to the centuries of stories layered upon them. And if we could step far enough back in time, far beyond the emergence of humanity, beyond the moment when Earth was even home to primates, we might find ourselves face to face with the makers of those stones. Makers whose forms have been erased not by malice, but by time itself. It is difficult to imagine Egypt without its humans. Their faces and titles dominate the monuments as though they had always been here. But what if the earliest great works along the Nile predate any terrestrial life entirely? What if before there was a single hominid to unify Upper and Lower Egypt, there was already an architectural tradition, one with no inscriptions, no record we can read, but a clear and deliberate sense of design? Such a thought can be unsettling because it challenges our neat progression of history. The tidy ladder of complexity that we like to think all civilizations climb. Consider Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Discovered in the 1990s, it consists of massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles carved with reliefs of animals, foxes, boars, cranes, scorpions. Some of these stones weigh up to 20 tons. Yet they were shaped and set in place by beings that, as far as we know, had no cities, no pottery, no writing. It dates back to around 9,600 BC, thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before the earliest known temples in Mesopotamia. Göbekli Tepe forces us to abandon the assumption that complex architecture must follow complex biological structures. Beings without kings, without armies, without bureaucracies, still found reasons and ways to move mountains of stone. It raises a tantalizing question. If this could happen on the Anatolian plateau at the dawn of the Holocene, why not on the fertile banks of a wetter, wilder Nile by non-human visitors? Imagine a presence there long before humanity. The river runs higher and broader than today, flanked by forests and marshes. Small outposts of unknown origin cluster along the banks, their inhabitants exploring, constructing, and perhaps tending early experiments. Knowledge travels with travelers and wanderers, passed not through parchment, but through memory and repetition. Over time, a shared ambition takes root to create something that will outlast them all. It would not have been a tomb, not in the sense the human pyramids were. Without familiar language, they had no way to leave behind the name of a ruler or the details of their origin. Perhaps it was a ceremonial platform, a star marker, a place where the visitors gathered to communicate with their origins or honor their mission. We do not know and perhaps never will. But they would have understood stone's stubbornness, how it resists the decay that claims organic matter. If you want your voice to carry forward into ages you cannot imagine, you speak in stone. Odd fact, the world's oldest known musical instrument is a flute made from the wing bone of a vulture found in a cave in Germany. It is over 40,000 years old and it still plays. Intelligent beings have always tried to make beauty last, whether in sound, pigment, or stone. The impulse to build something enduring is as old as the impulse to explore. If these early Nile builders left no inscriptions, what traces would survive? The stones themselves, worn but still standing, could be incorporated into later works. A future species, one with kings, scribes, and armies, might find these great shapes already waiting and decide to claim them, to add their own flourishes, to wrap them in the iconography of their own age. In that way, the origin of the structure could be obscured, buried under layers of later history. Historians are still debating whether any part of the Giza complex predates humanity. The mainstream view is that the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the associated temples are products of human periods alone. Yet the very nature of monumental building invites reuse. The Romans built amphitheaters on Etruscan foundations. Medieval cathedrals were raised on the ruins of Roman temples. There is precedent for such layering everywhere we look. Why not here? Picture yourself at dawn standing on the plateau in that earlier age. The horizon is pale gold, and mist curls off the river below. Around you, beings move with deliberate purpose, carrying baskets of stone chips, guiding sledges laden with blocks, communicating over the rhythmic thud of tools on rock. You notice the absence of ornament, no carved royal faces, no proclamations of power. This is architecture stripped of ego, devoted to something we can no longer name. Over the eons, the beings who built it vanish. Their signals fade. Their outposts crumble. Their beliefs dissolve into fragments. The stone remains, patient and silent. Then, thousands of years later, the first humans arrive. They inherit a landscape already marked by mystery, and they do what discoverers often do. They fold it into their story. They restore. They reshape. And in some cases, they recarve. Perhaps the Sphinx once wore a different face before human masons gave it their own. Perhaps the core of a pyramid stood for centuries before the casing stones went on. We can't prove it, but the possibility is enough to keep the question alive. And in that space between proof and possibility lies the wonder that keeps us looking at the stones, at the stars, and at the faint traces of beings whose forms were never recorded, but whose influence may still be felt in the weight of the ancient blocks. Part 4. The Puzzle of the Stones. Stand close to the base of a pyramid. Not the white gleaming sides you've seen in artists' reconstructions, but the raw ancient blocks of its exposed core. The sun catches on their edges, revealing a mottled surface of pale cream and rusty brown. You might notice something curious. Not all the blocks look the same. Some are fitted with almost impossible precision, their seams barely visible. Others are irregular, their edges chipped, the surfaces rough, and scattered among them are marks, grooves, chisel lines, circular impressions that don't seem to match the simple tools early humans are said to have used. This is the puzzle of the stone cutters of a forgotten age, if such an age existed before humanity. The official story tells us that the Great Pyramid, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, was the product of thousands of laborers using copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, and wooden sledges. Limestone was cut from local quarries, granite from faraway Aswan, and everything was hauled into place through the brute force of human effort. And yes, copper is capable of cutting limestone given enough time and determination. But then you encounter granite, dense, unyielding, with a hardness far beyond copper's ability to scratch. The granite used in the Great Pyramid's inner chambers weighs between 25 and 80 tons per block, and it was shaped to exact dimensions. Some of these blocks are polished so smooth that even today, cutting them with such accuracy would require diamond-tip tools or industrial saws. In other places, like the so-called King's Chamber, the granite beams overhead span the entire room, each weighing more than a loaded railway car. It's hard to reconcile this with the image of primitive beings pounding away at stone for years with handheld dolerite balls. When explorers first entered the pyramids in the modern era, they noticed something even stranger. Some granite surfaces bore marks of long, shallow cuts, as if a saw blade had passed cleanly through them. Others contained circular drill holes, some as much as several inches deep, with spiral grooves inside. To modern engineers, those grooves suggest a high-speed rotary drill, something capable of applying consistent pressure as it turns. Experimental archaeology has shown that copper tube drills with sand as an abrasive can produce similar holes, but the process is painfully slow, and the spiral grooves produced in experiments don't quite match the ancient examples. Historians are still debating whether these marks are simply the product of skilled, patient work with the tools of the time or evidence of techniques and materials that have since been lost. If they are the latter, then the question arises, who developed them and when? Could there have been earlier builders, perhaps long before humanity, who passed on some of their methods or whose abandoned blocks and cut stones were later reused by human masons? Odd fact, in 1837, Colonel Howard Vyse, an English soldier and antiquarian, discovered red-painted quarry marks in hidden chambers above the king's chamber. These marks contain the name of Khufu, and they were taken as final proof that the pyramid belonged to him. Yet, Vyse's methods have been questioned for decades, with some even suggesting the possibility of a 19th century forgery. Whether genuine or not, the marks tell us one thing. The assignment of ownership in archaeology often rests on fragile evidence, and our confidence in dating a monument can hinge on a single painted cartouche. The possibility of stone reuse complicates the picture. Across Egypt, archaeologists have found instances of later rulers dismantling older structures to build new ones, sometimes erasing the original inscriptions, sometimes leaving them visible as faint ghosts under fresh carvings. If this happened on the Giza Plateau, then some of the blocks we now associate with humanity could be far older. And unlike an inscription, stone offers no clue about when it was first cut. The sheer logistics of working with such massive blocks suggest a mastery of quarrying and transport that even early human sophisticated bureaucracy would have struggled to match. In Aswan, unfinished obelisks and half-cut granite blocks still lie in their quarries, bearing the marks of their makers. Some show fractures where the stones split unexpectedly. Others are perfectly shaped but never moved. The unfinished obelisk, over 1,000 tons in weight, was abandoned after cracks appeared during cutting. The fact that workers were even attempting to carve something that large hints at either astonishing ambition or a long tradition of moving megaliths that they inherited from earlier, non-human generations. Imagine the scene in that possible earlier age. The tools might not look like anything we recognize today. Perhaps they were still made of stone, but used in ways we no longer understand. Perhaps they had discovered ways to soften certain rocks chemically, making cutting easier, a theory occasionally floated in fringe archaeology, though never proven. Or perhaps they had mechanical devices, simple but effective, that multiplied strength without the complexity of modern engines. Whatever they used, the results were enduring. Blocks so precisely shaped that 4,000 years of weather and earthquakes have failed to break their joints. It's worth remembering that advanced technology doesn't have to mean something out of a science fiction film. The ancient world often solved problems with clever innovations that we overlook because they seem too simple. Roman concrete formula, lost for centuries, produced structures that still stand today, while many modern equivalents crumble within decades. Polynesian navigators could cross thousands of miles of open ocean without a compass, using only the stars, waves, and the flight of birds. The stone cutters of Giza, whether human Egyptians or someone earlier, may have had their own suite of lost techniques, developed slowly, handed down through generations, and then forgotten. Odd fact, in some parts of Egypt, particularly around old quarry sites, ancient tool marks remain on rock faces that were abandoned mid-cut. Some of these marks suggest a scooping method where large chunks of stone were carved out in a continuous curve, something that's hard to replicate with pounding stones alone. Walking among the pyramids today, You can still see the evidence of unknown hands in every surface. The precision varies from block to block, hinting that some may indeed have come from different periods or been made by different entities with different skills. In the shadow of the pyramid, it's not difficult to imagine those earlier stone cutters, anonymous now, shaping the first great blocks of Giza, their energy and presence mingling with the dust, their work destined to be claimed by others. And so the puzzle remains. Are these marks, these blocks, these improbable feats of shaping and moving stone purely the work of humans? Or are they the legacy of a much older chapter in Earth's story? The stone is silent, but it holds the possibility in every chisel line, every drill hole, every impossible fit. And if you place your hand on its surface, feeling the warmth fade into coolness as the sun sets, you might sense, not answers, but the echo of the hands, or appendages, that came before. Part 5. The Ice Age Veil. If you could peel back the layers of time and stand here on the Giza Plateau 20,000 years ago, the air would feel different on your skin. The sun would still be warm during the day, but the nights would be sharper, colder. You might glance north and see a sky heavy with clouds, a rarity in modern Egypt. And if you could step beyond this narrow valley, you'd find a planet caught in the grip of the last ice age. During the last glacial maximum, enormous ice sheets blanketed North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia, locking away vast quantities of the planet's water. Sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are today. The outlines of continents were different. Islands, now separated by wide channels, were once connected by broad plains. In the Mediterranean, coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries, and the Nile Delta, now a flat fan of fertile land, would have extended much farther into the sea. Although Egypt itself was too far south for glaciers, it felt the Ice Age's influence in other ways. The atmosphere was drier in some periods, wetter in others as global wind and rain patterns shifted. There were years when the monsoons reached farther north, feeding the Nile with a richer flow, and other times when the rains retreated and the river ran thinner. The Sahara, too, was not yet the unbroken expanse of sand we see today. Pockets of grassland and steppe dotted the landscape, interspersed with rocky highlands and seasonal watercourses. Odd fact, while early life forms in the Nile Valley may have been adapting to these changes, woolly mammoths were still roaming far away in Siberia and North America. In fact, some mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until about 4,000 years ago, meaning there were still mammoths on Earth at the same time the Great Pyramid was supposedly being claimed by humans. The overlap of such vastly different worlds is one of history's quiet wonders. If an advanced non-human culture existed in the Nile Valley during the Ice Age, they would have faced a landscape in constant flux. The river might have shifted its course more often than in later times. Its floodplains could have been more expansive in wet years, retreating in dry ones. The beings living here would have needed to adapt constantly, moving their installations, changing their resource practices, perhaps learning to navigate waterways that no longer exist today. Now, imagine that during one of the more stable climatic windows, when the rains were dependable and the Nile's flow steady, this culture decided to build something enduring. They might not have thought of it in the same way humans did. Instead of a tomb for a single ruler, perhaps it was a communal beacon, a place for ceremonies tied to the cycles of nature, the stars, or the planet. They might have chosen the Giza Plateau, not just for its elevation, which kept it safe from floods, but for its position relative to celestial markers. When the climate shifted again, the consequences would have been devastating. Around 12,900 years ago, the world plunged into the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. Temperatures dropped rapidly. Rainfall patterns changed abruptly, and many large animal species went extinct. In North America, the megafauna vanished. In the Nile Valley, plant and animal communities would have been transformed. If a civilization had thrived here before this event, they might have been scattered or even erased by the changing environment. Historians are still debating whether non-human societies of that era were capable of building on the scale of the pyramids. Mainstream archaeology says no, pointing out that advanced organization is not evident in the geological record before human times. Yet there are anomalies. Structures like Göbekli Tepe prove that large organized forces could exist among pre-agricultural beings. Stone circles in Nabta Playa deep in the Egyptian desert are aligned to the stars and date back as far as 7,000 years ago, hinting at an astronomical awareness older than the pyramids themselves. Odd fact, if you could have stood at the Giza Plateau in the late Pleistocene, you might have looked west across the Sahara and seen distant mountains capped with seasonal snow. It's not an image we associate with Africa, but in colder times, snow in the highlands of the Maghreb was more common. If monumental structures existed here before the end of the Ice Age, the melting of the great ice sheets and the accompanying rise in sea levels could have hidden much of their supporting evidence. The Nile Delta, in particular, would have been inundated as the seas rose, potentially burying entire installations and smaller monuments beneath the waters of the Mediterranean. The Giza Plateau, safely inland and elevated, might have been one of the few places where the largest constructions could survive unscathed. Picture those earlier builders watching the slow transformation of their world. Perhaps they saw the Nile's floodplain shrink, the green retreating toward the riverbanks. Perhaps they noticed the air growing warmer year by year, the storms changing in character, the migratory birds arriving at different times. And perhaps they signaled their successors to remember not just the changes they were living through, but the structures they had built. Maybe they believed that one day someone would stand here again and understand. By the time humanity emerged, the Ice Age was long over. The pharaohs inherited a Nile that was calmer, more predictable. But if the Giza Plateau already held monumental stonework by then, it would have been an irresistible prize, ready to be claimed, reshaped, and folded into the narrative of divine kingship. That possibility changes the way we see the pyramids. They might not just be symbols of human power, but survivors from a time when the planet itself looked and felt very different. A time when ice and thaw dictated the shape of continents and alien cultures rose and fell in step with the great climatic pulse of the Earth. And so when you stand at Giza today and feel the dry wind on your face, you might also feel faintly the ghost of that ancient chill. The air carries no ice crystals now, but the stones remember. Part 6. Myths of the Great Deluge. Before the age of humans, before cities rose from the mud brick, before the first footprint was pressed into stone, there were stories. Stories passed from entity to entity, over energy sources on riverbanks, and in the quiet hours before dawn. Among the oldest of these stories, in nearly every culture that survived into recorded history, is a tale about water. Not the gentle seasonal floods that life loves, but an overwhelming, unending surge, a flood that swallows the world. In the ancient Near East, the Sumerians told of Zisadra, a righteous being warned by a god to build a vessel before a deluge came to erase all life. Later, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the character Utnapishtim recounts a similar rescue, surviving with his kin and creatures to repopulate the land. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah receives instructions to construct an ark, weathering 40 days of rain while the waters rise above the mountains. The Greeks had their own version in Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus by retreating to a small wooden chest and washing ashore on Mount Parnassus. Egypt's own flood myths are quieter, more folded into creation itself. In the Heliopolitan tradition, the god Adam emerges from the primordial waters of Nun, creating the first mound of earth. From there, he brings forth the first gods, the sky, the air, and eventually the world. Though the Egyptian myth is more cosmic and symbolic, some scholars have wondered if its imagery, the land rising from endless water, might be a distant echo of an actual inundation remembered dimly across generations. Such memories could have roots in real events. Around 12,000 years ago, the world was emerging from the last ice age. Vast glaciers melted, releasing torrents of water into the oceans. Global sea levels rose more than 100 meters, drowning coastlines and reshaping continents. One particularly dramatic event known as Meltwater Pulse 1A raised sea levels several meters in less than a century. Imagine being a coastal or riverine entity then. Each year, the water creeping farther inland, bases lost, resources submerged. If the Nile Delta was already utilized in some form, entire installations could have been erased beneath the rising Mediterranean. Odd fact, Deep beneath the waves of the Black Sea, archaeologists have found traces of ancient shorelines and freshwater mollusks buried under layers of saltwater species. This suggests that around 7,500 years ago, the Mediterranean may have broken through the Bosporus and flooded what was then a large freshwater lake. To the entities living there, it would have seemed as though the sea itself had risen overnight. Some even argue this event could have inspired later flood myths. Historians are still debating whether oral traditions can accurately preserve memories of such ancient catastrophes. Linguistic and anthropological studies suggest they can. In Australia, Aboriginal stories describe ancient coastlines and islands that were submerged more than 7,000 years ago, details that match geological reconstructions. If this is possible there, why not along the Nile? Perhaps the priests of Egypt's earliest temples recited verses about a great flood, not as metaphor, but as history. History that had already slipped so far into the past that it took on the tone of myth. If the pyramids or their earliest foundations predate humanity's emergence, then their builders might have lived through such a flood. Picture it, standing on the Giza plateau, watching the waters advance year after year, carrying debris from far upstream, swallowing fields and valleys. Beings would have retreated toward higher ground, first to the ridges, then to the hills, and finally to the monuments themselves, the highest and most solid things in the land. For a time, the pyramids might have been islands in a drowned world. Even after the waters receded, the memory of that inundation could have remained, passed down through signals. Over centuries, as communication changed and the specifics blurred, the flood might have taken on a divine quality, a punishment from the cosmos or a cosmic reset. Later civilizations might have looked at the ancient stoneworks and assumed they had been built in response to the disaster, perhaps to honor the forces that spared the survivors. Odd fact, some ancient Egyptian temple reliefs show boats large enough to carry multi-ton obelisks along the Nile. These massive barges built of cedar from Lebanon were technological marvels in their own right. It's tempting to imagine that even in pre-human times, vessel-building traditions could have supported large-scale evacuations or movements during great floods. The universality of flood myths suggests that they are more than just imagination at work. They may be the collective memory of a planet that has seen the sea reclaim the land more than once. For the Nile Valley, such a flood could have been both a catastrophe and a turning point, destroying installations but also perhaps preserving the largest and most enduring structures by isolating them above the reach of the waters. By the time humanity rose, these stories might have been fragments recited in rituals, half-believed but still potent. The pharaohs could have seen themselves as the inheritors of that survival, the rulers of a land reborn from the flood. Whether they knew the true age of the monuments they claimed is uncertain, but the stones would have stood through it all, watching the waters come and go, holding in their silent mass the memory of a world that drowned. Close your eyes and imagine the Sahara, not as the endless heat-shimmering expanse of gold and beige we know today, but as a landscape alive with green. Rivers snake across wide floodplains, their banks shaded by acacia trees. Herds of gazelle and antelope scatter at the approach of unknown explorers. Crocodiles slide silently through slow-moving water. In the distance, the surface of a great lake glints under the afternoon sun. This is not a fantasy. It is what much of the Sahara looked like for thousands of years during the African humid period between roughly 14,500 and 5,500 years ago. Subtle changes in the Earth's orbit altered the monsoon patterns of Africa. The rains shifted northward, drenching the Sahara and turning it into a vast savanna. Satellite images today reveal the ghostly traces of ancient rivers and lake beds beneath the sand, like the veins of a dried leaf. Archaeologists working in what is now the deepest desert have uncovered tools, pottery shards, and rock art depicting animals that could never survive there today: elephants, giraffes, and even hippos. These finds tell us that the Sahara was once home to thriving presences. Odd fact, some of the rock art shows boats, long, sleek vessels with high prows carved into cliff faces hundreds of miles from any present-day coastline. These are not the papyrus skiffs of the later Nile, but sturdier-looking craft, perhaps designed for river travel or for crossing large lakes. It is a strange, almost haunting image. A fleet of boats sailing across what is now one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The African humid period would have transformed Egypt's environment as well. The Nile's floodplain would have been lush and expansive, capable of supporting large operations with relative ease. Seasonal floods would have been predictable and generous, replenishing the soil. The desert plateaus, including the Giza Plateau, would have been far less hostile, perhaps dotted with grasses and shrubs rather than bare rock and drifting sand. If the earliest phases of the pyramids or their foundations were conceived during this Green Age, their construction would have been far more feasible than in the hyper-arid conditions of later Egypt. Abundant water could have been used not only for sustaining the workforce, but also for practical purposes like lubricating sledges carrying heavy stones. Resources would have been plentiful, reducing the logistical challenges of maintaining thousands of units. Transporting stone might have been easier too. Vessels could have navigated not just the Nile, but the seasonal rivers and lakes that crisscrossed the region. Historians are still debating how quickly the African humid period ended. Some evidence suggests a gradual drying over centuries. Other data points to abrupt shifts, possibly triggered by changes in ocean currents or large-scale climatic events. What is certain is that the Sahara's transformation from green to gold was devastating for any presences that lived there. Rivers vanished, lakes shrank into muddy basins, and fertile land turned to dust. Communities would have been forced to migrate, seeking refuge in areas where water still flowed, like the Nile Valley. This migration could have brought skilled constructors, craftsmen, and traders into closer contact with those already operating along the Nile. They may have carried with them knowledge from other parts of the Green Sahara, techniques for working stone, architectural ideas, or symbolic markers. Over time, these influences could have merged with local traditions, giving rise to something entirely new. Odd fact, in southern Egypt's Nabta Playa, archaeologists have found a series of stone circles and alignments dating back at least 7,000 years, possibly earlier. Some of these stones are aligned to mark the summer solstice, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of astronomy long before the appearance of written records in Egypt. It is tempting to imagine that such knowledge was part of a broader network spread across the Green Sahara. When the rains finally failed for good, the desert returned with a vengeance. What had been a continent-spanning grassland became a barrier, cutting Egypt off from much of Africa to the west. Trade routes disappeared, and the Green Sahara slipped into memory. But if monumental structures had been built during that earlier age, they would have remained standing on high ground while the land around them turned to sand. Picture the pyramids not surrounded by an ocean of desert, but rising from a patchwork of fields, grazing lands, and streams. Imagine their reflection in a pool left by a summer storm, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. This was the world of the Green Sahara, a world that could have nurtured large-scale building projects long before humanity took the throne. As the centuries passed and the land dried, those monuments would have taken on a different meaning. To later peoples, they might have seemed the work of gods, built in an age when the world was more generous. The memory of the Green Sahara might have been preserved only in stories, half-believed legends about a time when the desert bloomed, when rivers ran where now only sand lies. And like all such stories, they would have carried a warning. Nothing lasts forever, not even the land beneath your feet. Part 7. Celestial Secrets and Hidden Depths. If you stand on the Giza Plateau at night, far from the glare of modern Cairo, the sky opens like an ancient book. The air cools quickly after sunset, and the horizon takes on that particular velvet darkness where stars don't just appear. They seem to press forward, closer than you expect. Even now, in a time when city lights have stolen much of the night's brilliance, Orion's belt still hangs clear above the desert, 3 points of light in a perfect line. But thousands of years ago, under skies unpolluted by electric light, the stars would have been so sharp they cast faint shadows on the sand. For beings living before the invention of clocks, the night sky was both a map and a calendar. You could tell the time by the positions of certain stars. You could know when to act or prepare for changes by watching the first pre-dawn rise of a particular constellation. And if you were a builder, someone laying the foundations for a monument meant to last for thousands of years, you might choose to align it with the heavens themselves. The most famous of these ideas is the Orion correlation theory proposed by Robert Bauval in the 1990s. He noticed that the three main pyramids of Giza, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, are not perfectly in line but offset slightly, just like the stars Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka in Orion's belt. When he looked at the sky charts, he found that the pyramid's layout matched the stars' positions most closely around 10,500 BC. In that same epoch, the constellation of Leo would have been rising directly in the east during the spring equinox, right where the Sphinx gazes eternally. If true, it suggests that the builders might have been commemorating a date thousands of years before humanity. Mainstream Egyptology has been skeptical of this theory, pointing out that similar alignments can occur by chance and that no written records link the pyramids directly to Orion's belt. Yet, even without the Orion theory, the precision of the pyramid's alignment to true north is astonishing. The Great Pyramid sides are aligned within a fraction of a degree, a feat that would be challenging even with modern surveying equipment. Historians are still debating how ancient beings achieved this. One plausible method involves watching the simultaneous transit of two circumpolar stars, using their crossing point as a fixed reference for true north. But here's the catch. Because of a slow wobble in the Earth's axis known as precession, those star pairs line up perfectly only at certain times in history. Measurements suggest that the stars best suited for this method would have been aligned several centuries earlier than the accepted human construction date of the Great Pyramid. Odd fact, ancient cultures divided the night sky into groups of stars called decans, each rising at a specific time of the year and serving as a kind of stellar clock. Observers could tell the hour during the night simply by looking at which decan had risen above the horizon. This star clock system was so precise it could measure time to within 20 minutes over 1,000 years before mechanical clocks appeared. If a pre-human culture worked on the Giza Plateau, their relationship to the stars might have been even deeper. Without written language, astronomy might have been a living tradition passed from observer to observer. Aligning massive stone structures with celestial markers could serve both as a sacred act and as a practical tool, anchoring seasonal calendars, navigation methods, and ceremonies to fixed points in the sky. Precession changes the backdrop of the heavens so slowly that a single lifetime cannot detect it. But over centuries, the shifts become noticeable. Imagine a tradition in which every generation recorded the position of Orion's belt during a specific event. After many generations, the elders might notice that the stars no longer rose in exactly the same spot. To fix that moment forever, to make sure future generations remembered where the stars once stood, you might decide to record it in stone. The Orion alignment is not the only stellar link proposed for Giza. Some researchers have pointed to the shafts in the Great Pyramid, which appear to be aimed at specific stars. Around 2500 BCE, these would have pointed toward Orion's belt and the star Thuban in the constellation Draco, then the pole star. But if those shafts were aimed in an earlier era, they could have targeted entirely different stars, reflecting a different celestial priority and perhaps a different culture. Odd fact, many ancient cultures linked Orion with a great hunter or warrior. In Egypt, Orion was associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife and rebirth. Aligning a monument with Orion might therefore have been more than just a technical achievement. It could have been a symbolic connection between the ruler and the divine cycle of death and renewal. If the alignment dates to 10,500 BCE, as Bauval suggested, the intended symbolism might be even older, perhaps rooted in myths from a time before the Sahara turned to sand. Standing on the plateau under a clear night sky, you can almost feel the weight of that continuity, the idea that across thousands of years, different beings stood in the same place, looked up at the same stars, and found meaning there. Whether they were pharaohs, priests, or anonymous stargazers from a forgotten age, the builders of Giza seem to have worked with a cosmic awareness that we are only beginning to rediscover. The stars move slowly, but the stones move even more slowly. Together, they form a dialogue between earth and sky, written in a language we're still learning to read. And if the Giza monuments truly preserve alignments from an older sky, they are not just buildings. They are time capsules carrying a message from a world whose constellations have shifted, but whose ambition still glitters above us. If you run your hand over the blocks of the Great Pyramid, you are touching limestone, stone that once lay on the floor of a shallow sea millions of years before humans appeared. The Giza Plateau itself is part of a vast geological formation laid down in the Eocene epoch when much of northern Egypt was submerged beneath warm tropical waters. That ancient sea teemed with life, coral reefs, mollusks, fish, and the occasional large marine predator. When the sea receded and the land rose, the sediments hardened into limestone, trapping within them a memory of that ocean world. It's easy to forget when looking at a pyramid that its building blocks are fossils in disguise. Tiny shells and the skeletons of microscopic sea creatures are embedded throughout the stone. If you examine certain blocks closely, especially those taken from deeper layers of the plateau, you can still see the outlines of these fossils, coiled shells, fragments of coral, and even the impressions of ancient sea plants. In some places, the fossils are so dense that the rock looks almost like a solidified shell. Odd fact, one of the earliest scientific studies of the Giza stones was not by an Egyptologist, but by a geologist. In the 19th century, travelers noted the presence of fossilized seashells in the pyramid blocks, a discovery that led to early speculation about the ancient environment of the Nile Valley. These observations have since been confirmed repeatedly. The stones of Giza are quite literally the hardened remains of an ancient seabed. For most of human history, this was simply the material at hand, quarried locally and shaped into blocks. But some researchers have noted differences in the composition of certain stones, suggesting that not all of them came from the same quarry. A few blocks, particularly in the pyramid's core, contain marine sediments and fossils not found in the immediate Giza formation. Could this mean that some of the stone was brought from elsewhere? If so, where and why? Historians are still debating the implications. The conventional view is that all the main limestone came from the Giza Plateau itself, with harder granite imported from Aswan. But if some of the limestone blocks show different fossil assemblages, it could indicate that older, pre-quarried stones from other sites were reused. A possibility that opens the door to the idea that the pyramids incorporated material from earlier, perhaps even much older non-human structures. The sea's mark on the stones is not only visible in fossils. Marine sediments leave chemical traces, the composition of certain minerals, the presence of specific isotopes, and the patterns of weathering all hint at their aquatic origins. When rain or wind eats away at the limestone today, it sometimes reveals fresh fossil surfaces, as if the stone is slowly remembering its past life. Imagine this for a moment. The blocks of the pyramids began their journey millions of years ago in the body of a sea creature. That creature lived, died, and sank to the ocean floor, where its remains became part of a growing layer of sediment. Over eons, the sediment compressed into limestone. Then, in some much later age, whether in human times or long before, beings cut it free from the earth and set it in place to form a monument. The journey from seabed to skyline is not just long, it's almost incomprehensibly long. Odd fact, whales once swam where the desert now lies. In Egypt's western desert at a site called Wadi al-Haytan, Valley of the Whales, archaeologists have uncovered the fossilized skeletons of ancient whales that still bore vestigial hind legs. This was around 40 million years ago when the Tethys Sea covered much of the region. The same geological processes that created the limestone of Giza shaped the environments where those whales swam. For a pre-human culture, if such existed in the Nile Valley, these marine fossils might have been more than just stone curiosities. They could have inspired myths or been seen as signs of an earlier watery world. It's not impossible that ancient builders noticed the shells in their building material and connected them to stories of great floods or primordial seas. Even in later Egypt, the idea of creation emerging from watery chaos was central to religion. The god Adam's first act was to rise from the waters of Nun onto the primeval mound, a motif that resonates strongly with the geological truth beneath Giza. If the pyramids incorporated stone from different locations, some of it could even have come from sites that were themselves much older ruins. In that case, the marine fossils embedded in certain blocks would be a kind of double time capsule. First, a record of a prehistoric ocean. Second, a silent witness to the dismantling and repurposing of earlier structures by later builders. Historians are still debating whether variations in the Giza limestone are simply a result of quarrying different layers on the plateau or a sign of more complex sourcing. Detailed petrographic studies, the microscopic analysis of rock samples, continue to reveal subtle differences that don't quite fit the simplest models. While these studies are often framed as purely geological, their implications for archaeology are profound. If stone was moved across long distances or across great spans of time, it changes the story of how the pyramids came to be. Next time you see an image of the Great Pyramid, imagine stripping away the layers of history, the weathered surface, the ancient hands that shaped the stone. Imagine the block as it was in its first life, lying under a shallow sea, sunlight filtering down through warm green water. Imagine the slow rain of shells and silt that buried it, the pressure that turned it to stone, and the long, slow uplift that brought it to the surface. In this way, the pyramid is not only a monument to ambition, it is a monument to the Earth's own deep history. The sea is gone, but its memory remains, locked in every block, waiting for the rare person who knows how to read it. And perhaps, for those with imagination enough, it whispers a reminder that all land was once sea, and all monuments, no matter how eternal they seem, are built on the bones of forgotten worlds. Stand on the modern shore of the Mediterranean at Alexandria, and you can feel the salt wind on your face, smell the brine, and hear the hiss of waves breaking on stone. But beneath those restless waters lies another Alexandria, an older, sunken city that once bustled with markets, temples, and harbors. Earthquakes, floods, and the slow rising of the sea swallowed it centuries ago. Divers exploring the bay have found columns, statues, and even massive blocks of quarried stone lying silent in the sand, as if waiting for someone to remember them. The loss of coastal cities is not a uniquely modern phenomenon. The shifting of land and water is as old as civilization itself. The Nile Delta, flat and fertile, has always been vulnerable to the twin forces of the river and the sea. Sediment from the Nile slowly pushes the shoreline outward, but at the same time, storms, floods, and the gradual rise of sea level can reclaim it. Over thousands of years, towns and settlements have appeared, thrived, and then been erased, not only from maps, but from memory. If we think about the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose dramatically, the scale of what may have been lost is staggering. More than 100 meters of sea level rise over several thousand years would have drowned vast stretches of land, including any coastal installations. In the context of Egypt, that means much of the prehistoric Nile Delta. Any outposts, ceremonial sites, or even monumental works that may have existed there could now lie under the Mediterranean, buried under layers of silt. Odd fact, in 2000, underwater archaeologists discovered the lost city of Heracleion, also called Thonis, in Abukir Bay, just northeast of Alexandria. Once a thriving port during the late Pharaonic and early Hellenistic periods, it sank about 1,200 years ago, likely due to a combination of earthquakes and liquefaction of the sandy soil. The site contains not only statues and temples, but also docks, anchors, and the remains of wooden ships preserved for centuries under mud. Now, imagine pulling back the water not by 1,200 years, but by 10,000 or more. The shoreline of Egypt would have been far to the north of its present position. The delta would have been larger, with branching channels feeding into wide lagoons and marshes. These would have been perfect places for installation. Abundant fish, fertile soil, and easy access to river and sea trade routes. If an early advanced non-human culture existed along the Nile, this is where they might have concentrated their efforts. And when the seas rose, those efforts would have been erased. Historians are still debating whether we should expect to find pre-human monumental architecture underwater. Some argue that if such structures existed, they would have been dismantled by later peoples or destroyed by the forces of erosion and the pounding of waves. Others point out that stone structures can survive remarkably well under the right conditions, especially if they are quickly buried by sediment, as many shipwrecks and ancient harbors have been. In the Mediterranean and beyond, examples abound. Off the coast of Japan's Yonaguni Island, strange stepped formations have sparked debate over whether they are natural or man-made. Near India's Gulf of Khambhat, sonar surveys have revealed large geometric patterns on the seabed, possibly the remains of ancient structures. And in the Bahamas, so-called Bimini Road has led some to speculate about sunken prehistoric sites. Whether any of these are truly artificial remains unresolved, but they illustrate how much of our early history could be hidden beneath the waves. Odd fact, sonar mapping of the Nile Delta's underwater shelf has shown buried river channels that no longer exist on land. These submerged rivers may have once been the main branches of the Nile, guiding early patterns. If we could dive along these channels, we might find the remains of outposts or even larger constructions sealed away from view for thousands of years. If the pyramid's earliest phases predate humanity's emergence, their builders could have been part of a larger coastal presence, one that also built in more vulnerable lowland areas. The great structures at Giza, elevated on a plateau, would have been spared the rising sea, while their sister sites near the coast were lost. In that case, the pyramids might be not only monuments, but survivors, markers left by a culture whose true extent lies drowned and hidden. Standing on the shore today, looking out over the Mediterranean, it's easy to imagine that line of ancient installations stretching into the distance, now erased by the tide. Imagine harbors lined with stone quays, centers filled with the scent of activity, operators offering signals in temples whose columns now lie scattered on the seabed. Imagine that somewhere out there, beneath the green water, lies the missing chapter of Earth's story, a chapter that could explain why the discoverers of Giza seem to arrive, already knowing how to work in stone on a colossal scale. The ghosts of coastal cities still whisper in the waves. You can't hear the words, but you can feel their weight, especially when you remember that the sea is always hungry and the shore is never still.